A merciless blizzard rages, swallowing Dartmoor whole. "We cannot die here, Arthur. Please, not here," Isabel sobs, clutching her frozen child. A mountain man then emerges from the swirling snow, drawn by an impossible detail. He offers them his brutal, silent sanctuary. What he then demands will change their world forever. Stonecross, the hamlet nestled uneasily at the moor's edge, had promised a haven, a carefully arranged new beginning. It had offered the illusion of safety, a hearth, and a future. Instead, it had revealed itself as the very terminus of her journey, the place where all lines of possibility converged into a precipice of despair. The man she had traveled across treacherous seas and unforgiving lands to meet had met her not with welcome, but with a chilling, calculated cruelty, his face a mask of revulsion upon seeing the small, bundled form of Arthur. He had cast them out without a second thought, consigning them to the insatiable maw of the gathering tempest, a cruelty that would forever brand itself upon her soul. Isabel's fingers, stiffened and rendered almost useless by the biting cold, locked around Arthur, holding him so fiercely he might have been an extension of her own rapidly freezing flesh. Each gust of wind, a monstrous entity laden with razor-sharp ice crystals, felt like a personal, deliberate assault, tearing at the threadbare fabric of her cloak, systematically stripping away the last vestiges of precious warmth. She recalled the long, arduous journey, the rattling carriage over rutted roads, the nervous flutter of anticipation in her chest, the quiet, desperate prayers for a future free from the gnawing bite of poverty and the shame of a past she yearned to leave behind. She had dared to envision a sturdy home, a welcoming hearth, perhaps even a gruff but ultimately kind man who might see past her circumstances to the resilient spirit within her, and recognize the innocent light in Arthur's wide, trusting eyes. But the stark reality had been a brutal, soul-numbing slap of cold air, far colder and more devastating than the blizzard itself. Elias Thorne, the prosperous wool merchant, had taken one swift, damning look at Arthur's small, vulnerable face, and his own had hardened into the unforgiving granite of the moor itself. He had no use for complications, he had declared, his voice cutting through the wind like a shard of ice. No patience for a past that manifested as a small, breathing, utterly dependent human being. The gates of civilization, with their hollow promises of shelter and order, had clanged shut with an echoing finality, leaving Isabel and Arthur on the brutal, exposed side of human mercy. Now, the savage, unyielding beauty of the moor demanded its ancient due, its price exacted in shuddering breaths, the slow, insidious creep of numbness, and the fading light of consciousness. Hope, that tiny, tenacious flame Isabel had painstakingly nurtured through every prior hardship and disappointment, was now flickering wildly, threatening to extinguish itself faster than the hoarfrost crystallizing on the looming granite tors, which stood like ancient, silent sentinels guarding the secrets of ages past. Each desperate stumble in the deepening drifts of snow was a step closer to oblivion. Each whisper of Arthur's name a desperate, unheard plea to a god she feared had irrevocably turned his face away. The scent of pine, usually a comfort, was now lost to the sterile, freezing air. The only sound was the wind, a mournful dirge that promised only an end. Indeed, the stark cruelty of Elias Thorne had been a spectacle that lingered even in the hardened memories of Stonecross's residents. It was not merely the rejection of a promised bride. It was the deliberate, almost premeditated expulsion of a woman and her child into a storm widely known to be lethal, an act that spoke of a deeper, more ingrained malice than simple inconvenience. Whispers had long trailed Thorne, hushed tales of a fortune built on cutthroat deals, of lands acquired through shadowed, questionable means, and of a heart seemingly utterly devoid of genuine human tenderness. Some speculated his desire for a wife had been purely for societal appearance, a decorative piece to complete his newly polished wealth, never intended as a true companion or the mother of a shared future. Others spoke of a deep-seated, hidden shame, a past grievance that made him recoil violently from any reminder of vulnerability, dependence, or the unpredictable nature of human connection. Isabel, in her innocent desperation and urgent need, had been tragically blind to the true predator lurking beneath the merchant's veneer of respectability, a man who viewed human beings as mere transactions, and a flawed one at that. He carried a darkness within him that even the blizzard struggled to hide, a chill that seeped deeper than the winter air. The cold was no longer just a searing pain. It was transforming, subtly, into a creeping numbness, a gentle, insidious lullaby that promised a quiet, effortless end to all suffering. Arthur's small body, once so vibrantly alive in her arms, was growing impossibly heavy, his breath shallow, almost imperceptible against her cheek. Isabel's own eyelids felt weighted with lead, each blink an immense effort, blurring the swirling white world into a hazy, eternal void. Just as the last, fragile spark of consciousness threatened to finally vanish, surrendering them both to the profound silence of death, a shadow, impossibly vast and dark, detached itself from the swirling chaos of the snow. A figure, stark and imposing against the swirling white backdrop, as massive and silent as the ancient tors themselves, appeared on the horizon. It moved with a deliberate, almost supernatural purpose, utterly alien and yet impossibly profound in that desolate, dying landscape. It was a silhouette against the white, a stark, unreadable promise of something, anything, other than the cold, suffocating embrace of imminent death. Her fate, and the fading flicker of Arthur's life, now teetered precariously on the razor's edge of this sudden, imposing, and utterly unknown presence. The shadow that detached itself from the swirling chaos of the snow was not a hallucination, but a man, impossibly vast and dark against the blinding white. He moved with a deliberate, almost preternatural purpose, his form emerging from the blizzard as if born of the ancient stones and unforgiving winds themselves. Isabel's frozen heart lurched, caught between a primal terror of the unknown and the last desperate flicker of a hope she dared not acknowledge. This was not the civilized world she knew, but a raw, untamed wilderness where men were as much a part of the landscape as the granite tors. His presence was an abrupt, visceral shock, a jarring rupture in the monotonous drone of the storm, forcing upon her a desperate choice between the certain death of the cold and the terrifying uncertainty of this silent, imposing stranger. He loomed over them, a towering figure clad in hides and rough-spun wool, his face obscured by a thick beard, frosted with rime, and a wide, fur-lined hood. His eyes, when they finally met hers, were the color of deep mountain ice, sharp and penetrating, yet holding an unsettling stillness. He said nothing, no word of greeting or pity, only extended a massive hand, gloved in thick leather, towards Arthur. It was an offer both stark and imperative, a silent command that brooked no argument. Isabel hesitated, a desperate, irrational fear warring with the desperate, rational need to save her child. Was this salvation, or merely another, more menacing form of perdition? The questions screamed silently in her mind, yet her body, weak and trembling, found itself incapable of defiance. Her fingers, stiff and numb, released their death grip on Arthur, letting him be taken by this mountain of a man. The transfer was swift, almost imperceptible. Arthur, a small, fragile bundle, disappeared into the folds of Gideon's embrace, swallowed by the vastness of his presence. Suddenly, Isabel found herself lifted as well, an unexpected, almost jarring lightness. Her feet no longer found purchase in the deepening snow. She was simply held, cradled with a strength that felt both unyielding and oddly gentle. The air, though still biting, seemed less sharp, momentarily shielded by the warmth emanating from his formidable frame. She could feel the rough texture of his deerskin tunic against her cheek, inhale the scent of pine smoke and damp earth that clung to him, a wild, untamed fragrance that spoke of deep forests and isolated hearths. He moved with the effortless grace of a predator, each step purposeful and unwavering, defying the blizzard's relentless onslaught. The wind howled a mournful dirge, but now a new rhythm entered Isabel's fading consciousness, the steady, powerful beat of the mountain man's heart, a stark contrast to her own fluttering, weak pulse. It was a sound that both terrified and strangely soothed her, an anchor in the swirling chaos. The journey felt endless, a blur of swirling white and the rhythmic crunch of Gideon's heavy boots on the snow. Isabel drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind a kaleidoscope of frozen images. The bitter rejection of Elias Thorne, the desperate scramble from Stonecross, Arthur's small blue lips. And now, the unwavering silhouette of this silent giant. She clung to the warmth of his presence, a tiny, fragile flame against the overwhelming cold. Through a haze of exhaustion, she registered the subtle change in the air, the wind softening just slightly, the faint yet distinct scent of wood smoke growing stronger, promising warmth, life. Then, abruptly, they stopped. Before them, nestled into the craggy side of a granite tor, as if grown from the very rock itself, stood a small, sturdy cabin. Its walls were of rough-hewn stone, its roof heavily thatched, smoke curling lazily from a squat stone chimney, a beacon in the desolate landscape. It was not a grand dwelling, but it possessed an elemental strength, a defiant resilience against the moor's harsh embrace. A faint, amber glow pulsed from a single window, a soft, inviting light that seemed to banish the encompassing darkness of the storm. This, Isabel realized, was his world, a place of stark survival forged in defiance of both man and nature. Inside, the contrast was immediate and overwhelming. The bitter cold gave way to a wave of enveloping heat, the sterile air of the blizzard replaced by the rich, earthy scent of peat smoke, dried herbs, and simmering stew. Gideon placed Arthur gently onto a bed of rough animal furs beside a roaring hearth, its flames dancing a vibrant ballet against the stone walls. The fire, built deep within the hearth, cast long, dancing shadows that stretched and contracted across the small, orderly space. Its warmth, a palpable, living entity, seemed to coax the life back into Isabel's frozen limbs, thawing the ice that had begun to claim her very bones. Gideon moved with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to solitude and self-reliance, his large hands surprisingly deft as he unwrapped Arthur from his sodden blankets, then turned to Isabel, his gaze unwavering. He offered her a thick wool blanket, its rough texture scratchy but immeasurably comforting, and a wooden bowl brimming with a steaming, fragrant stew. Isabel watched him, her gaze darting between his stoic face and the sanctuary he had so unexpectedly provided. He was a man of few words, his presence speaking volumes without uttering a sound. He offered no comfort, no reassurance, only the essentials for survival: warmth, food, and shelter. The silence between them was not empty, but heavy with unspoken histories, with the raw gratitude and the gnawing fear that twisted within her. She had traded one unknown for another, a freezing death for a life within the silent, watchful world of this stranger. She felt the heavy weight of his scrutiny, a gaze that seemed to pierce through her layers of fear and exhaustion, seeing not merely a desperate woman and her child, but something deeper, something perhaps even he could not fully articulate. It was a look that lingered, almost searching, as if in her and Arthur he recognized a fragment of a lost past, a forgotten purpose. This man, known only as Gideon Stone, existed in a realm beyond the conventions of Stonecross. He was a solitary figure, a creature of the moor, his very being woven into the fabric of its ancient landscape. His cabin was more than just a shelter. It felt like a haven carved from primeval earth, a place where the wild spirits of Dartmoor held sway. Isabel caught sight of a small, intricately carved wooden bird, perched on a rough-hewn shelf, its design ancient and unlike anything she had ever seen. It hinted at a connection deeper than simple survival, a sense of belonging to this unforgiving land that resonated with something ancient, almost fated. It was then, as the last vestiges of the blizzard raged just beyond the thick stone walls, that Isabel truly grasped the monumental shift in her fate. She had stumbled not merely into a refuge, but into a new existence, one tethered to the wild heart of the moor and the enigmatic man who guarded it, a place where the rules of her old world held no sway, and where her very survival now depended on the silent, unspoken covenant between them. She was no longer just a rejected bride. She was a supplicant, utterly at the mercy of this silent, watchful protector, her breath held captive by the unknown future unfurling within the heart of his isolated mountain home. The peat fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls of the cabin, painting the scene in hues of amber and crimson. Isabel, wrapped in the scratchy warmth of a wool blanket, watched Arthur, now sleeping peacefully, his small chest rising and falling in rhythmic slumber, a stark contrast to the desperate, shallow breaths he had taken just hours before. The warmth of the hearth was a violent juxtaposition to the frigid embrace of the blizzard that still raged outside, its fury muffled by the thick stone walls. Gideon Stone, a man whose presence filled the small space with a quiet, potent energy, moved with the measured grace of a seasoned woodsman, attending to the flames, his movements efficient, almost ritualistic. He offered no further words, his silence a language in itself, understood through the directness of his actions. Isabel's mind, though dulled by exhaustion, was a battlefield of warring emotions. The relief of immediate survival was profound, a sweet balm to her terror-stricken soul. Yet it was interwoven with a gnawing fear, a chilling awareness of her precarious position. She had escaped certain death in the snow, only to find herself a guest, or perhaps a prisoner, in the isolated dwelling of a man who lived beyond the reach of laws, both of man and of king. His sanctuary felt less like a benevolent act, and more like a stark, unwavering declaration of a territory he claimed. The air thrummed with unspoken questions, with the raw tension of two worlds colliding within the confines of four stone walls. She was a refugee from a society that had cast her out, and he, a reclusive spirit of the wild, whose solitude she had now irrevocably breached. Gideon finally turned to her, his gaze unwavering, piercing through the weariness that clouded her eyes. His voice, when it came, was a low rumble, weathered and resonant, like the deep echoes of the moor itself. He spoke not of pity or welcome, but of the stark realities of his world, of the unforgiving nature of the mountain, and the unyielding demands it placed upon those who sought its protection. He outlined his expectations with a blunt honesty that bordered on severity, his words like sharp strokes delineating the boundaries of her temporary haven. This was no charitable lodging, but a place of strict order, maintained through diligence and self-reliance. He offered sanctuary, yes, but not comfort without cost, not shelter without contribution. He made it clear that while she and Arthur could stay, their presence in his solitary world was not without conditions. Isabel would earn her keep, not through grand gestures, but through the mundane, repetitive tasks that kept a household, even one as remote as this, functioning. She would tend the small garden once the snow melted, if she had the skill. She would mend the worn fabrics, gather the dried peat, fetch water from the icy stream when the time came. He spoke of the harshness of the mountain, of the constant struggle against nature's indifference, and the absolute necessity of every individual's contribution. It was a life of unending labor, a stark contrast to the delicate domesticity promised by Elias Thorne. Yet, in his uncompromising honesty, Isabel found a strange, unexpected solace. There was no pretense, no false promises, only the unwavering truth of survival. As Gideon spoke, Isabel's gaze drifted around the small, meticulously kept cabin. Every item seemed to have its designated place, every tool hung precisely, every surface wiped clean. The furs on the bed, the rough-hewn table, the few simple wooden implements, all spoke of a life pared down to its most essential elements, free from the superficial clutter of the world she had known. This was a man who lived by his own rules, governed by the rhythm of the seasons and the ancient wisdom of the land. His reclusive existence was not merely a preference, but a carefully constructed shield, a deliberate choice to live untethered from the fickle cruelties of human society. The very air in the cabin seemed to hum with his presence, with the weight of his past, and the silent, watchful guardianship he now extended over them. A small, leather-bound journal lay open on a shelf near the hearth, its pages filled with neat, precise script, and beside it, a collection of dried herbs, meticulously labeled. This man, so seemingly uncultured and wild, possessed a quiet literacy, a hidden depth that hinted at a past far more complex than that of a simple hermit. Perhaps, Isabel mused, his retreat to the wilderness was not simply a flight from civilization, but a purposeful severance, a deliberate choice to leave behind a world that had betrayed him much as it had now betrayed her. His solitude, she sensed, was a carefully constructed fortress, protecting wounds unseen, scars unacknowledged. The cold certainty of Stonecross's rejection, the betrayal that had driven her to this frozen edge, now seemed a distant memory, replaced by the immediate, tangible reality of this man's world. Gideon's eyes held a deep, profound sadness, a pain that seemed to mirror the desolate beauty of the moor itself. It was a fleeting glimpse, quickly veiled, but it revealed a hidden truth. He, too, was a pariah, a soul scarred by the world beyond the peaks. His stern pronouncements were not born of malice, but of a fierce, almost desperate need to maintain the fragile peace of his isolated existence, a peace that her sudden arrival had undoubtedly shattered. The rules he laid down were not to punish, but to protect, both his sanctuary and perhaps, unknowingly, himself. He finished his stark declaration with a final, unblinking stare that challenged her to comprehend the gravity of his terms. The help he offered was a hard-won gift, a sanctuary he allowed, but not without expecting something in return. The mountain, he reminded her, demanded constant vigilance, tireless effort, and an unwavering respect for its ancient, unyielding laws. He offered no softness, no easy path, only a stern, unyielding promise of survival, a temporary refuge from the storm in exchange for her usefulness, her quiet diligence, and her unwavering adherence to the unwritten rules of his wild, solitary domain. The silent challenge hung in the air, a stark, profound question about her will to endure, about her capacity to become a part of this harsh, beautiful new world. The early days in Gideon Stone's cabin were a testament to Isabel's innate resilience. The rhythms of her new life were starkly different from anything she had known, dictated by the harsh demands of the mountain and the silent expectations of its solitary inhabitant. She rose with the first sliver of dawn, the air crisp with the scent of pine and damp earth, and worked tirelessly until the last embers faded in the hearth. Her hands, once accustomed to finer fabrics and the gentle tasks of a gentler life, quickly adapted to the rough reality of chopping kindling, hauling water from the half-frozen stream, and tending the small, carefully hoarded stores of food. Each day was a quiet battle, a methodical application of will against the wilderness, and with each small victory, a fragile sense of accomplishment began to take root within her. Gideon watched her with a quiet, almost imperceptible scrutiny. He offered no praise, no encouraging words, but his silence was no longer purely a barrier. It had become a measure of his observation. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his expression, the slight nod that acknowledged a task well done, the brief glance that conveyed approval. Isabel, for her part, was determined to prove her worth, not just to him, but to herself. She refused to be a burden, a charity case. The shame of Stonecross, the searing sting of Elias Thorne's rejection, fueled her resolve. She would not only survive here, she would contribute, creating a space for herself and Arthur within this formidable man's world. One particularly bitter morning, the wind howled through the crevices of the tor with renewed ferocity, threatening to tear the very thatch from the roof. The small, carefully stacked pile of kindling had dwindled to almost nothing, and the main woodpile, Gideon's domain, was buried under a fresh drift of snow. He was out, checking his traps, and the cabin was growing steadily colder. Isabel, refusing to let Arthur shiver, knew what she had to do. Taking the small, dull hatchet from its hook, she ventured out, the cold biting at her exposed skin. Her first attempts at splitting the larger logs were clumsy, the axe head glancing off the frozen wood, sending jarring shocks up her arms. But with each swing, she learned, adjusting her stance, finding the grain, until finally, with a grunt of effort, a log split cleanly in two. It was a small, physical triumph, but it warmed her more than the fire itself, a silent declaration of her burgeoning strength. Gideon returned later that afternoon, his face grim from the cold. He entered the cabin, his keen eyes immediately scanning the space. He paused at the hearth, where a new pile of neatly split kindling lay, and the fire roared, a vibrant, defiant orange. His gaze lingered on the axe, returned to its hook, and then, for a long moment, rested on Isabel. There was no comment, no question, only a subtle, almost imperceptible softening in the usually impenetrable depths of his eyes. It was a fleeting moment, a silent acknowledgement that she had not only met the challenge, but had done so with an unexpected tenacity. She was proving to be more than just a refugee. She was a survivor, a force capable of bending the raw elements of this world to her will. But it was not just brute strength or perseverance that slowly began to weave Isabel into the fabric of Gideon's life. What he had overlooked, what Elias Thorne had dismissed, was the quiet, transformative power of her feminine presence. His cabin, a place of stark utility and solitary survival, slowly began to soften around the edges. She found a wild chamomile patch on a rare, sunnier slope and brewed a calming tea for Arthur's restless nights, its gentle aroma filling the air. She discovered an old, neglected mending basket, filled with worn hides and tattered wool, and with nimble fingers began to repair Gideon's torn tunic and reinforce the soles of his heavy boots. Her stitches, though simple, were strong and precise, a quiet act of care. One day, while exploring the cabin's meager stores, she found a small, neglected patch of dried, fragrant lavender, long forgotten in a dusty corner. She crushed the brittle blossoms, mixing them with beeswax she found in a forgotten jar, and carefully mended a tear in one of Arthur's small, worn shirts. The faint, sweet scent, so different from the earthy musk of the cabin, began to permeate the air, a subtle, almost invisible transformation. It was a gentle encroachment, a quiet declaration that this place, once merely a sanctuary for solitary survival, was slowly, almost imperceptibly, becoming something more. She was not merely tending a fire. She was coaxing warmth into the very soul of the cabin, stitching the disparate threads of their lives together, transforming a utilitarian shelter into a nascent home. Her quiet acts were a subtle challenge to Gideon's carefully constructed solitude, a soft, persistent whisper of human connection that began to chip away at the granite walls of his self-imposed exile. The quiet domesticity Isabel brought, initially ignored by Gideon, was proving to be the unexpected key. Her knowledge of medicinal herbs, her ability to mend torn garments with skill, her patient attentiveness to Arthur's needs, and the subtle ways she infused warmth and order into the Spartan cabin were not grand, heroic gestures. Instead, they were the quiet acts of creation that began to transform a harsh, unyielding space into a place of solace and belonging. The scent of pine and smoke was now mingled with the faint aroma of freshly baked bread, a rare treat made from meager stores. and the quiet humming of a lullaby for Arthur. She was turning Gideon's sanctuary, a place of mere survival, into a true home, a haven of warmth and unexpected tenderness. One evening, as the first snowflakes of a new storm began to fall outside, Isabel looked up from mending a tear in Gideon's deerskin cloak. He sat opposite her, quietly sharpening his hunting knife, the rhythmic scrape of stone against steel the only sound. A sudden, deep chill settled over the cabin, a premonition that pierced the fragile warmth they had cultivated. A faint, distant howl echoed across the moor, not the familiar cry of a wolf, but something far more unsettling, more predatory, a sound that spoke of hungry desperation and encroaching menace. Gideon's hand stilled on his knife, his head cocked, listening. His eyes met hers, and in their depths, she saw a stark warning, a raw, primal awareness of a threat that had just announced its dangerous proximity. The fragile peace they had forged was about to be shattered, challenged by a force far more ancient and menacing than the cold. The howl, a mournful lament carried on the rising wind, was not merely the cry of a beast. It was a premonition, a chilling announcement that the fragile peace within Gideon's cabin was about to be savagely rent apart. The mountain man's hand, so steady moments before as he sharpened his knife, froze. His gaze, usually impenetrable, now held a glint of primal vigilance, his senses honed to the subtle tremor that rippled through the quiet air of the moor. He rose, his movements fluid and silent, and moved towards the small, iron-bound door, his hand resting on the latch, not opening it, but listening, his head tilted. Discerning the nuances of the approaching danger, Isabel, her heart now a frantic drumbeat against her ribs, knew that this was not a challenge of man, but of the wilderness itself, a raw, elemental force demanding its due. A relentless blizzard descended upon the moor, a sudden, furious assault that dwarfed the previous storms. The world outside became a canvas of blinding white, an impenetrable wall of wind and snow that pressed against the cabin walls with a palpable force. Yet it was not the wind's fury that truly gripped them with dread, but the subtle, insidious shift in Arthur's breathing. The child, who had seemed to recover so remarkably, now began to cough, a deep, rattling sound that tore at Isabel's heart. His skin, usually pale, grew flushed, and his small body became unnervingly hot. Fever, a silent, deadly enemy, had entered their sanctuary. Gideon, abandoning his vigil at the door, knelt beside Arthur, his large hand gently pressing against the child's forehead, his brow furrowed, a grim line etched into his weathered face. He reached for his leather-bound journal, its pages filled not just with observations of the wilderness, but with ancient remedies, with knowledge gleaned from generations of living at the edge of survival. He spoke in low, urgent tones, his voice a gravelly murmur as he described the herbs he needed, specific roots and dried leaves. Remedies known only to those intimately familiar with the moor's secret pharmacopoeia. But the blizzard raged, an impassable barrier, and the necessary herbs lay hidden beneath impossible depths of snow, in places only Gideon knew. Despair, cold and sharp, began to prick at Isabel's resolve. The cabin, once a haven, now felt like a sealed tomb. Isabel's mind, however, was not one to yield to despair. The life she had known, for all its comforts, had instilled in her a subtle, often overlooked knowledge of the natural world, a quiet understanding of remedies and comforts. She remembered the wild chamomile she had found, and the patch of elderflower near the stream, both known for their calming and fever-reducing properties. More than that, she remembered her grandmother's old remedies, simple concoctions of honey and warmed spirits, gentle balms for inflamed airways. Gideon watched, a flicker of surprise in his ice-blue eyes, as Isabel moved with a quiet, fierce determination. She took the small, dried herbs she had carefully collected, blending them with boiled water and a spoonful of Gideon's precious, hoarded honey. She applied warm compresses to Arthur's fevered brow, her touch gentle but firm. As the hours stretched into an agonizing eternity, the storm outside reflecting the tempest within the cabin, Arthur's small body fought bravely. Isabel, fueled by a mother's fierce, unwavering love, nursed him through the long, dark night. Gideon, usually a man of action, now stood as a quiet sentinel, his presence a silent strength in the face of their collective helplessness. He replenished the fire, ensured the cabin remained sealed against the elements, and watched Isabel's every move, a growing respect replacing the initial surprise in his gaze. Her delicate hands, once seemingly fragile, moved with a surprising strength and sureness, applying poultices, murmuring soft words of comfort to the struggling child. By the first faint light of dawn, the blizzard had begun to abate, its fury slowly dissipating into a soft, ethereal quiet. Arthur's fever, though still present, had broken. His breathing was still shallow, but steadier, and the color had begun to return to his small, pale face. Isabel, utterly drained but exhilarated by the first tentative signs of recovery, collapsed onto the furs beside him, tears of relief tracing paths down her smudged cheeks. In that moment of profound shared vulnerability, the unspoken barriers between them crumbled, replaced by a raw, immediate bond forged in the crucible of fear and desperate hope. Gideon knelt beside her, his gaze intense, revealing a depth of emotion she had not yet witnessed. He spoke then, not in commands, but in a voice that was rough with suppressed pain, his words quiet confessions of a life marked by loss. He spoke of his own past, of a wife and child lost to a fever similar to Arthur's, a tragedy that had driven him from the world of men and into the solitary embrace of the moor. He confessed the gnawing guilt, the unbearable helplessness, the reason for his self-imposed exile. His voice, usually so controlled, now carried the tremor of old wounds reopened, of a grief that had festered in silence for years. In turn, Isabel, emboldened by his honesty, found her own voice. She spoke of the desperation that had driven her to accept the mail-order bride proposal, the harsh judgment of a society that had condemned her for circumstances beyond her control, and the utter desolation of being cast out with Arthur. She spoke of the constant struggle to protect her son, to shield him from the world's indifference, and the enduring pain of feeling utterly alone. Their shared confessions were not a mere exchange of histories, but a profound communion of wounded souls, two outcasts finding solace in each other's unspoken understanding. In that moment, the shocking truth was not an external revelation, but the bare, exposed vulnerability of their own hearts, laying bare the traumas that had shaped them, sealing their partnership as two pariahs who had found an unlikely haven, and perhaps a deeper connection within the storm-bound walls of a mountain man's cabin. As the last echoes of their confessions faded into the quiet stillness of the cabin, a profound shift occurred. Gideon reached out, his calloused hand gently touching Isabel's arm, a gesture of comfort and connection more eloquent than any words. It was a silent acknowledgement, a shared understanding that transcended their individual pains. They were no longer merely a reclusive mountain man and a desperate, rejected bride, but two wounded souls, bound by a shared fragility, united by the fierce, protective love for a child. Yet, the mountain, ever a capricious master, held one last, subtle twist in its unforgiving embrace. Just as the first rays of the sun pierced through the dissipating clouds, casting a golden light upon the snow-covered peaks, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor shook the cabin. It was not the wind, nor the shifting earth, but a sound from the valley below, a distant, insistent bell from Stonecross, a sound that spoke of the world they had both fled, a world that seemed determined to reclaim its lost and wayward souls. The fragile peace they had forged, the tentative bond they had found, now hung precariously, threatened by the insistent, unwelcome summons from a past that refused to stay buried. The distant peal of the Stonecross bell, carried on the crisp, newly settled air, was a stark intrusion into the fragile peace of Gideon's cabin. It was a summons from the world they had both so desperately sought to escape, a jarring reminder that even in the deepest solitude of the moor, the tendrils of the past could reach. Yet, the immediate concern, the profound relief of Arthur's recovery, held them firmly in the present. The child, pale but breathing steadily, slept on, a testament to Isabel's unwavering care and Gideon's quiet fortitude. The crisis had forged a bond between them, a silent covenant born of shared fear and ultimate triumph. In the days that followed, a new rhythm settled into the cabin, a delicate dance of companionship and quiet labor. The unspoken understanding between Gideon and Isabel deepened with each passing hour, built not on flowery words, but on shared tasks and silent gestures. They worked side by side, gathering fuel, preparing meals, and tending to the small, vital needs of their makeshift family. Isabel, no longer just a transient presence, moved with an easy familiarity within the cabin, her hands now adept at the practicalities of wilderness life. Gideon, in turn, found his solitary routine subtly altered, softened by the presence of Arthur's bright chatter and Isabel's quiet strength. The scent of pine and peat smoke now mingled with the comforting aroma of baking bread and dried herbs, a subtle but profound shift in the very essence of their shared space. One afternoon, as the snow began its slow, reluctant retreat, revealing patches of gnarled moorland and ancient stone, Gideon taught Isabel how to set a simple snare for rabbits, demonstrating the intricate knotwork with surprising patience. Her fingers, though clumsy at first, soon learned the precise movements. Later, Isabel, in turn, showed him how to mend a particularly stubborn tear in his hunting coat with a needle and thread, her small, precise stitches a stark contrast to his rough, practical mends. He watched her, a hint of something akin to admiration in his eyes, a silent acknowledgement of her unexpected skills. They shared stories, not with dramatic pronouncements, but through casual anecdotes, exchanged over steaming mugs by the fire. Gideon spoke of the ancient paths of the moor, the hidden springs, the lore of the land. Isabel recounted tales of her childhood by the sea, of the bustling markets, and the quiet rhythms of village life, painting pictures of a world he had long abandoned. Arthur, in the innocent resilience of childhood, flourished in this new environment. He trailed after Gideon like a shadow, fascinated by the mountain man's quiet strength, mimicking his movements, trying to learn the names of the birds and the strange, gnarled plants of the moor. Gideon, who had once been a bastion of solitude, found himself unexpectedly softening, his gruff exterior slowly melting under the warmth of the child's unwavering affection. He carved a small, wooden bird for Arthur, its wings spread as if in flight, a silent gift that spoke volumes of his growing attachment. Isabel watched these interactions, her heart swelling with a bittersweet joy. This found family, born of desperation and forged in the crucible of the wild, was slowly knitting itself together, thread by fragile thread. One evening, as a gentle rain began to fall, washing the last remnants of snow from the higher peaks, Gideon unearthed a small, leather-bound box from beneath the hearthstone. It was old, its surface worn smooth by time, and inside, nestled amidst dried heather, lay a single, tarnished silver locket. He held it in his palm, his gaze distant, clouded with memory. He spoke of his own family, his ancestors who had lived on this very moor for generations, their lives intertwined with the land, their stories etched into the very stones. He explained that the locket had belonged to his mother, a gentle woman who possessed a deep knowledge of herbs and the healing arts, much like Isabel. It was a revelation that sent a shiver down Isabel's spine, a sense of predestination, as if her arrival here was not mere chance, but a fulfillment of something ancient and preordained. The moor, it seemed, had a way of drawing kindred spirits back to its heart. He spoke of a distant relative, a woman renowned for her healing touch, who had once lived in a small cottage on the edge of Stonecross, and how her kindness had saved many. He described her as a quiet force, a beacon of hope in a world often too harsh. Isabel listened, a strange sense of recognition stirring within her. She recalled whispered tales from her own grandmother, a woman celebrated for her healing skills and quiet strength, who had spoken of a distant, revered cousin from the moors, a woman of the stone, known for her unyielding spirit and gentle hands. The coincidence was too profound to be mere chance. Their families, though separated by generations and circumstance, had been connected by a shared lineage of quiet wisdom and healing. Their meeting, it seemed, was not an accident, but an echo of a deeper ancestral thread that bound them to this ancient land and to each other. The locket, now passed into Isabel's hands, felt impossibly warm, a tangible link to a past that now felt inextricably entwined with her own. This newfound connection, a revelation of shared ancestry and a subtle sense of destiny, solidified the fragile bonds between them, giving their found family an unexpected, almost sacred depth. But just as the warm glow of this revelation settled over them, a discordant note pierced the quiet calm. A sudden, sharp crack echoed through the valley, not the sound of a falling tree, nor the familiar report of Gideon's hunting rifle, but the unmistakable, ominous snap of a dry branch underfoot, followed by the faint but distinct whimper of a dog. It was too close, too deliberate for a wild creature, and it carried the distinct, unsettling resonance of human intrusion. Gideon's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing, the hard lines of his face returning. The peace was broken. The outside world, with its unpredictable dangers, had found its way to their door once more, a dark promise of impending threat carried on the gentle evening breeze. The sharp snap of a branch, followed by the distant, uneasy whimper of a dog, sliced through the tranquil evening air, shattering the fragile peace of Gideon's cabin. It was a sound that spoke not of the wilderness, but of human intent, a clear sign that the outside world, with its unpredictable dangers, had once again found its way to their secluded sanctuary. Gideon's head snapped up, his body tensing. The warmth of the hearth and the recent revelations of kinship instantly replaced by the primal vigilance of a seasoned hunter. His eyes, usually deep and still, now glittered with a dangerous intensity, scanning the encroaching shadows beyond the small window. He moved with a silent, predatory grace towards the door, his hand instinctively reaching for the heavy hunting rifle that rested above the mantel. Isabel's heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She scooped Arthur into her arms, holding him close, her gaze fixed on Gideon. The mountain man, who had become her silent protector, her unlikely companion, was now a formidable bulwark against an unseen, yet keenly felt, threat. The scent of wood smoke, usually so comforting, now seemed to carry a metallic tang of apprehension. The peaceful domesticity they had so carefully cultivated was now a target, a beacon for whatever darkness had pursued Isabel from the world beyond the moor. Through the window, as the last vestiges of twilight faded into a moonless night, a flicker of movement caught Gideon's eye. A figure, dark and menacing, detached itself from the gloom of the ancient oaks, followed by the faint gleam of what appeared to be a lantern. It was not one man, but several, moving with a grim determination that spoke of a hunt, of a pursuit. The air grew heavy with an unspoken certainty. They had come for Isabel, and perhaps for Arthur. This was not a random encounter. It was a deliberate encroachment, the past finally catching up to the present. The leader of the group, a man whose shadow seemed to stretch impossibly long in the flickering lantern light, was unmistakable: Elias Thorne. His presence on the moor, a place he detested and rarely ventured, was a chilling confirmation of Isabel's deepest fears. He was flanked by two burly men, their faces hard and unyielding, carrying crude bludgeons that gleamed dully in the dim light. Thorne's voice, when he finally spoke, was a cold, venomous hiss, cutting through the silence of the night. He declared that Isabel was his property, his mail-order bride, and that the child, Arthur, was a complication he would deal with. His words were not a request, but a demand, laced with an arrogant certainty that he was within his rights, that the laws of civilization and possession still held sway, even in this wild, untamed place. Gideon remained silent, his stance unwavering, the rifle held steady. He was no longer just a solitary hermit, he was a fierce guardian, his very presence radiating a primal defiance. Thorn, emboldened by Gideon's silence, began to advance, his men fanning out and circling the cabin. He spoke of Isabel's unpaid passage, of the broken contract, of the humiliation she had caused him in Stonecross. He saw her not as a human being, but as a runaway chattel, a damaged commodity to be retrieved and punished. His cruel words, however, contained a deeper, more insidious revelation. He insinuated that Isabel's past was far more scandalous than she had let on, whispering hints of a disgraced family and a secret that would ensure no decent man would ever take her in. He used these veiled threats to try and undermine Gideon's resolve, to paint Isabel as unworthy of his protection, a burden that would only bring trouble to his quiet existence. As Thorn's words hung in the cold night air, Isabel's blood ran cold. The man was not alone in his malicious pursuit. A figure detached itself from the deeper shadows, a woman whose face was shrouded, but whose posture radiated an unsettling familiarity. It was Mrs. Albright, a prominent, outwardly pious woman from Stonecross, a pillar of the community who had always maintained a public facade of charity. Her presence was a chilling betrayal, revealing that Thorn's campaign against Isabel was not just about ownership, but about reputation, about maintaining the rigid social order of Stonecross. Mrs. Albright, with her subtle machinations and whispered slanders, had likely been instrumental in spreading the very rumors that had driven Isabel to such desperation, twisting truths to suit her own vindictive agenda, perhaps fueled by a long-standing rivalry with Thorn, or a desire to maintain her own perceived moral superiority within the tight-knit community. She was the viper in the grass, the unseen hand that steered the current of local opinion. The air grew thick with tension, the confrontation poised on a knife's edge. Gideon's grip on his rifle tightened, his gaze never leaving Thorn. He was ready to fight, to defend his home and his new family against this intrusion. But Isabel, seeing the raw, brutal determination in Thorn's eyes, and the conniving presence of Mrs. Albright, knew that a physical confrontation would only bring more danger, more bloodshed, and potentially endanger Arthur. She could not bear the thought of Gideon, her silent protector, facing such odds, risking everything for her. Before Gideon could make a move, before Thorn could give the order, Isabel stepped forward, her voice surprisingly steady, though tinged with the tremor of sacrifice. She declared that she would go with Thorn, that she would face whatever consequences awaited her in Stonecross, if only he would leave Gideon and Arthur in peace. It was an act of profound selflessness, a desperate gamble to shield those she had come to love. She made a solemn promise to Gideon, a silent vow to return, or to ensure Arthur would be safe. With a final, agonizing glance at Arthur's sleeping form and the stoic, conflicted face of Gideon, Isabel stepped out into the cold night, placing herself willingly into the clutches of the very forces she had once fled. A desperate sacrifice to buy time, to protect the fragile haven she had found, and to save the lives of the only family she had left. The door closed behind her, a chilling echo in the silent, starless night, leaving Gideon alone in the cabin, the weight of her sacrifice pressing down on him like the ancient stones of the moor. The heavy thud of the cabin door closing behind Isabel was a sound that echoed not just through Gideon's small home, but through the very core of his being. It was the sound of sacrifice, of a desperate gamble made by a woman who had, against all odds, carved a place in his solitary heart. The silence that followed was a deafening void, punctuated only by the soft, innocent breathing of Arthur. still asleep in the firs, oblivious to the battle that had just been lost, and the greater one that was now inevitable. Gideon stood rigid, his rifle still clutched in his hand, his gaze fixed on the door, a storm of fury and resolve brewing in his ice-blue eyes. They had taken her, these men of false civility, these wolves in human clothing. Believing they had won, they had mistaken his solitude for weakness, his silence for indifference. They were gravely mistaken. He knew Elias Thorne's ruthlessness, his grasping nature. He knew the insidious power of Mrs. Albright's whispers. Isabel's sacrifice, noble and selfless though it was, would not be enough. They would not merely take her, they would break her, not just for the perceived slight, but to reassert their dominion, to send a clear message to anyone who dared defy the established order of Stonecross. Gideon's mind, usually a quiet pool of contemplation, now became a sharp, strategic instrument. He thought of the ancient paths of the moor, the hidden shortcuts, the treacherous bogs. He thought of the intricate network of his traps, not just for game, but for intruders. And he thought of the bonds he had forged, not with men, but with the land itself, and with the few, honest souls who understood its silent language. Dawn broke, painting the peaks in hues of rose and gold, but Gideon saw only the gray of injustice. He packed a small satchel, his movements precise and purposeful, leaving Arthur safely bundled in the furs, knowing the child would sleep for hours, protected by the residual warmth of the hearth. He left a note for Isabel, scrawled on a piece of parchment by the fire, a promise etched in rough, earnest words. Asterisk, I will come for you. Stay strong. Asterisk. Then, rifle in hand, he melted into the newly awakened landscape, moving with the silent stealth of a predator, following the barely perceptible tracks left by Thorne's party. He knew they would take Isabel to Stonecross, to Thorne's grand, suffocating house, a gilded cage meant to imprison more than just a body. He reached the outskirts of Stonecross by mid-morning, avoiding the main roads, moving through the gnarled woodlands that bordered the town. He saw the preparations for the public spectacle Thorne clearly intended, a hastily erected platform in the town square, a gathering crowd, a palpable sense of morbid curiosity. Thorne intended to make an example of Isabel, to parade his property and publicly humiliate her, solidifying his control over the town's narrative and its people. As Gideon approached, he noticed a subtle, familiar sign, a small bundle of dried heather tied to a lamppost, a silent signal he had taught Isabel, a mark indicating a general direction. Her spirit, even in captivity, was defiant, resourceful. The town square was already bustling, a mix of curious onlookers, gossiping women, and stern-faced merchants. Elias Thorne stood on the platform, preening, his voice booming as he recounted Isabel's transgressions, painting her as a deceitful, ungrateful woman who had attempted to defraud him. Beside him, Mrs. Albright nodded sagely, her face a mask of false piety, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Isabel stood before them, her face pale but resolute, her gaze fixed on some distant point, refusing to meet the sneering faces of her accusers. She had been stripped of her rough cloak, dressed in plain, ill-fitting clothes, a deliberate attempt to shame her. But just as Thorne raised his hand to pronounce his judgment, a low, guttural growl rippled through the crowd. From the shadowed alleyways emerged not Gideon, but a large, shaggy wolfhound, its eyes bright with intelligence, its hackles raised. This was Old Finn, a dog Gideon had once rescued from Thorne's abusive handlers, a creature of fierce loyalty and an uncanny ability to track. Finn moved through the crowd, his presence startling, scattering the curious onlookers. He went directly to Isabel, nudging her hand with his wet nose, a silent offering of comfort and solidarity. A murmur went through the crowd. The dog, a symbol of the wild, had chosen her. Then, from the back of the square, a deep, resonant voice cut through Thorne's pronouncements, echoing with the authority of the ancient moor itself. It was Gideon. He walked into the square, not rushing, not charging, but with a deliberate, unhurried stride, his rifle resting casually in the crook of his arm, his presence as imposing and unyielding as the granite tors. The crowd parted before him like water, a mixture of fear and awe in their faces. He did not speak to Thorn directly. Instead, he addressed the assembled townsfolk, his voice clear and unwavering, recounting Isabel's journey, her desperation, and Thorn's calculated cruelty. He spoke of the mail-order contract, not as a binding agreement, but as a transaction of a human life, a deed of ownership that no man had the right to claim. He presented the town with a stark choice: to stand with Thorn's greed and cruelty, or to acknowledge the simple truth of human decency. He then revealed his trump card, the old, leather-bound book he carried. It was a ledger, painstakingly kept by his ancestors, detailing not just the lore of the Moor, but the unwritten contracts, the fair dealings, and the quiet justice meted out over generations. And within its pages, he produced a faded deed, a document proving that the land on which Thorn's wool mill stood, the very foundation of his prosperity, had been acquired through a fraudulent transaction generations ago, stealing it from a small, honest family who had no voice. The rightful owner, Gideon declared, was a distant relation of his, a woman whose lineage could be traced directly to Isabel's grandmother. The revelation shocked the crowd into stunned silence. Thorn's empire, his very claim to legitimacy, was built on stolen land, a dark secret now exposed. Thorn, his face contorted with rage, lunged at Gideon, but old Finn, sensing the imminent danger, moved swiftly, placing himself between them, a snarling, protective barrier. Gideon simply met Thorn's fury with an unyielding calm, his eyes holding a depth of ancient wisdom. He offered Thorn a choice, not of violence, but of restitution. Either surrender his claim to Isabel and her child, along with a significant portion of his ill-gotten gains, to be redistributed among the town's neediest, or face public ruin and the full, undeniable truth of his deceit. The mountain man had not come for revenge, but for justice, his strategy honed by the harsh, uncompromising logic of the wilderness. He used not brute force, but the power of truth and the unwavering strength of the bonds he had forged, both with man and beast, to dismantle Thorn's carefully constructed world. Cornered, exposed, and facing the combined wrath of the mountain man, the loyal wolfhound, and the now outraged townspeople, Thorn visibly crumbled. His reign of cruel certainty was broken. He could not fight the truth, nor the silent, formidable strength of Gideon Stone. He capitulated, his voice a hoarse whisper, agreeing to Gideon's terms, his power, his reputation, shattered beyond repair. Mrs. Albright, pale and shaken, melted into the crowd, her influence withered. The triumph was not one of violence, but of quiet wisdom, of strategic brilliance, and of a profound understanding of the human heart, its greed, and its capacity for redemption. Gideon had saved Isabel, not by force alone, but by revealing the truth, by turning the very weapons of civilization, contracts, and social standing against its own corrupted agents. The main threat had been defeated, but the silent, treacherous undercurrents of human malice, though silenced for now, still whispered in the shadowed corners of Stonecross, a reminder that the world, even after justice, remained a place of constant vigilance. 9 months after the confrontation in Stonecross, a profound quiet settled over the high moor, a different kind of silence than the one Gideon Stone had known for so long. It was not the silence of solitude, but the rich, resonant stillness of contentment, a peace earned through courage and sacrifice. The cabin, once a stark refuge, now truly bloomed into a home, its stone walls echoing with the gentle sounds of a bustling, vibrant life. The scent of pine and peat smoke, always present, was now interwoven with the sweet, comforting aromas of freshly baked bread and simmering stews, a testament to Isabel's unwavering presence. The mountain man was no longer alone. Gideon moved through his days with a quiet grace, his movements still precise, but softened by a newfound ease. His hands, once solely accustomed to the axe and the snare, now gently cradled a small, squirming bundle wrapped in soft wool. The first child born of their unlikely union, a daughter with Isabel's gentle eyes and Gideon's strength, had arrived, bringing with her a profound, unspoken promise of new beginnings. Arthur, now older and brimming with a boundless energy, played by the hearth, crafting small, wooden figures with nimble fingers, a living echo of Gideon's own quiet artistry. He often looked at his baby sister with wide-eyed wonder, a nascent protector already stirring within his young heart. Isabel, her face radiant with a hard-won peace, sat by the hearth, nursing their daughter. The journey from a rejected mail-order bride to the mistress of this mountain home had been arduous, marked by storms both literal and metaphorical, by betrayals and fierce acts of protection. Yet, in the quiet strength of Gideon, in the innocent joy of Arthur, and in the soft, vulnerable presence of their new daughter, she had found not just sanctuary, but a belonging deeper than any she had ever dared to dream of. The moor, once a symbol of her desolate fate, now cradled their lives with a gentle, enduring embrace. The ancient Tours, silent sentinels of time, watched over their growing family, bearing witness to a love that had defied all odds. The defeat of Elias Thorne had reverberated through Stonecross, his reputation shattered, his ill-gotten gains redistributed as Gideon had demanded. The mill, now under new, fairer management, hummed with a different purpose, its profits now benefiting the very community Thorne had sought to exploit. Mrs. Albright, her influence diminished and her whispers silenced by the sheer weight of truth, faded into obscurity, her malice replaced by the collective relief of a town freed from her machinations. The small acts of courage, the quiet resilience of Isabel, and the uncompromising justice of Gideon had spun a new legend, a tale whispered around hearths throughout the moorland villages, of the mountain man who brought justice to the valley, and of the woman who found her strength in the wild. One crisp autumn morning, as Isabel walked with Arthur and Gideon through a sun-dappled glade, a shaft of light illuminated a cluster of ancient standing stones, half buried in the heather. It was a place Gideon often visited in quiet contemplation. As they stood there, a small, worn leather pouch caught Isabel's eye, wedged deep between two stones. Inside, nestled amongst dried herbs, she found a finely carved wooden comb, its teeth smooth with age, and a faded piece of parchment. On the parchment, in delicate, spidery script, was a genealogy, tracing her grandmother's lineage back through generations, not just to the woman of the stone, but to the very first inhabitants of this glade, people who had tended these very lands, healers and caretakers of the moor. It was a revelation that brought a profound sense of closure, of destiny fulfilled. Her bloodline was not one of shame and exile, but of deep roots in this very earth, a lineage of quiet strength and enduring wisdom that had always been destined to return to the heart of the moor. Her sacrifice in Stonecross had not only saved her new family, but had, in an unexpected twist, reclaimed a forgotten heritage, solidifying their right to this land not just by love, but by ancestry. The mountain man had not just found a mail-order bride and her child, he had rediscovered a lost piece of his own ancient history, entwining their destinies irrevocably with the very soul of the moor. And so, the story of Gideon and Isabel, of Arthur and their new daughter, became more than just a tale of survival. It became a testament to the enduring power of human connection, a living legend etched into the rugged landscape of the Dartmoor Fens. It spoke of a profound truth, that true courage is found not in grand, defiant acts, but in the quiet, persistent kindness of a protecting hand, in the selfless love that binds a found family together. It proclaimed that home is not merely a place of shelter, but a sanctuary, built brick by brick, moment by moment, on trust and shared purpose, a feeling of belonging so deep that it can heal the deepest wounds and withstand the fiercest storms. In the heart of the wild, amidst the ancient whispers of the moor, two scarred souls had not only survived, but had thrived, proving that the most profound redemption lies in the unwavering choice to protect, to heal, and to build a new world, one act of unthinkable compassion at a time. Did you enjoy this journey? Tell us from what corner of the world you're watching this story from. Leave your comment, and to make sure you don't miss the next adventure, subscribe to the channel.